Once there were two men who hated each other. They hated deeply. They hated passionately. And they hated more with each passing year. They also hated in secret. While their acquaintances assumed that they were joined together by a friendship founded upon the interests that they shared, and both men were quick to profess their devotion to one another, in their hearts, each separately regarded the other in a spirit of rivalry most bitter. Their hatred could do little more than seethe beneath the surface, however. In order to remain in the good graces of society, they bowed to the pressures of the genteel age in which they lived. Pressures as powerful as steam in a copper boiler, and no less scalding for being invisible. Always they conducted themselves, even when alone, with faux admiration and respect, while inwardly grinding their teeth whenever external circumstances brought them into each other's company. None knew that this hidden loathing existed, for they played their parts with such conviction that they themselves were unsure if the hostility was mutual. What everyone knew instead was that these two men, these greatest of friends, were keen enthusiasts of collecting, and they shared a similar obsession for discovering rare objects. Even more exciting to their acquaintances, the men were fixated upon items with magical properties. If a tool or artifact harbored the faintest trace of the occult, the arcane, or the metaphysical, they lusted after it almost beyond reason, and would disregard any expense or danger involved in its procurement. Their appetite for magic was boundless, and indeed it was the competition for these objects that lay at the heart of their contempt for one another. Knowing all this, it might seem odd, then, that their estates came to be tied together. How it happened, neither remembered precisely, and each secretly blamed the other for it, but in truth it had occurred long ago at one of the many gatherings that they both enjoyed hosting in their separate residences. Aside from being an unending game of one-upmanship, their exhibitions were also the highlights of the social scene, for who would miss the chance to be filled with wonder at viewing a newly discovered magical marvel, or to gasp in fear upon hearing a gentleman adventurer recount his latest death-defying exploits? Such things never grew old, and although everyone shared sly winks at many of their tales, certain that exaggeration played a larger role than the ghostly spirits or savage headhunters with which they thrilled their audiences, still everyone eagerly attended. At these events, the two men made sure to praise each other loudly, so as to leave no doubt regarding their friendship. A convincing act, as always, for on the evening in question it had thus caused a fair-minded individual to propose that if one of these two childless bachelors departed the earth before the other, then the remaining friend should inherit his magical collection, in order to give it the proper care and safekeeping that it deserved. This had seemed a splendidly sensible idea, at least on the face of it, and like the juiciest gossip, word of the proposal had flown from ear to ear throughout the gathering. Before either fellow could think of suitable objections, they were signing documents drawn up by a lawyer in attendance, while in the presence of 100 applauding witnesses. On that evening a toast was raised to friendships everlasting, and many backs were slapped with hearty gusto, even as two sets of molars were worn further down behind facades of gracious smiles. From that time forward, what was done could not be undone, not without setting tongues to wagging. And so the years continued to pass as their occult collections grew, with each man claiming his share of glories. One would reveal a painting which rearranged itself into a new composition when no one was looking. Then the other would elicit shivers from his guests with a grand clock, made of human bones, a clock which would click and tick, but would never chime, not until 1 minute before its owner was to perish. Returning from safari, one man would produce the severed horn of a strange creature which, when the horn was ground into a fine snuff and inhaled, allowed a person to visit the dreams of a nearby sleeper. Then the other man would show off a slim Arabian knife which left no mark, for it had the devious ability to pass harmlessly through any surface, while below that surface it still performed all the slicing work of an ordinary blade. Good or ill, helpful or not, as long as an item was imbued with some form of magic, these two fellows collected it. What use was an assortment of spoons that failed to lessen your appetite no matter how much you ate off of them? Such considerations hardly mattered, for in their collections utility was a pale cousin to the unique. There was a sextant for measuring differences in the affections of lovers, ropes which frayed upon command, a looking-glass which reflected the face of its previous viewer, and, more recently, a cloak which cast a living shadow of its wearer, like a doppelganger made of semi-solid smoke. Few months passed without some strange wonder being unveiled at one mansion or the other. Thus it went back and forth between the two men, their silent repugnance for each other increasing, while their collections filled with extraordinary objects, until one day, a frightened and breathless messenger arrived on the doorstep of Mr. Sherwood Stokes, this being the name of one of our two rivals. The note which the messenger relayed was brief, and dashed off in a hasty hand. "Come quickly, old friend. I fear I have overreached, and darkness enfolds me. Your assistance is urgently requested. M. Weston." Stokes read and reread those words while he ate his customary late breakfast on the veranda. He then pursued a newspaper, took his dogs for a walk, shaved, leisurely assembled his attire and items for the forthcoming journey, had a horse brought round, and proceeded to gallop at a wild and frantic pace across town to the estate of Montrose Weston, shouting at all who crossed his path that he was on a pressing mission of mercy. Upon arriving at his destination, he began to suspect that something was truthfully amiss when he had to tie up his own horse. Hearing no answer to his knock, he next had to let himself into the main manor. Weston's front doors opened with a funeral creak, which echoed through the well-furnished entrance hall, as if, with no people about, it had been reduced to a barren chamber. Stokes was curious in spite of himself. He was no stranger to mysterious affairs, and this was certainly a mysterious affair already. He strode through the hall, calling for Weston, for the staff, for anyone, but his own voice came back to him unanswered. It was a warm September day, so when at last he pushed open the door to the drawing room, he was surprised to find a blazing fireplace, and there, seated beside the fire in a high-backed chair, was Montrose Weston. The man's appearance was startling. Normally a hale and hearty fellow of 50, he looked to have aged 2 decades since Stokes had last seen him, not 1 month ago at Weston's most recent magical exhibition. "Come in, Sherwood," Weston called, and his voice was a reedy imitation of its usual braggadocian boom. His pale hand beckoned from beneath the layers of blankets that were draped across his shoulders and legs. "Enter, old friend." "Are you alone?" Stokes asked as he approached. "Where is Alexander?" "Dismissed. No one shall bother us. All the servants are gone. Let go." "Let go? Why would you do such a thing? Alexander has been your steward for—" "Couldn't be trusted. None of them. Besides, it was too dangerous." Weston continued to wave him forward. Come, I'll tell you everything." Cautious and perplexed, Stokes joined him by the fire. After his brisk ride, the heat was uncomfortable, requiring him to remove his riding coat, a task normally given to Alexander. As he searched for a place to lay the coat before finally deciding the bust of one of Weston's ancestors would do, Stokes once again found himself wondering if the hidden hatred he felt towards Weston was reciprocated. If so, then theirs was an act of theater years in the making, a performance he was not yet willing to be the first to bow out of, even when facing a Weston who appeared to be at death's door. He summoned a look of grave sympathy as he settled into the chair opposite his host. Weston nodded to the small table between them. "Would you mind pouring the brandy?" Stokes obliged, and soon each held a glass. Stokes sipped his delicately, for he desired a clear head. When Weston did not speak for some time, Stokes finally pressed. "Pardon me for stating the obvious, Montrose, but you do not look well." "Ha!" Weston cackled. "So obvious, is it? I had thought perhaps we might play a round of badminton on the lawn before my health became apparent." In good humor as always, Stokes said, but dark. I would scarcely recognize you as the same humorist who made the ladies blush with the impish antics of your Cloak of Living Shadow mere weeks ago. This turn of events is sorrowful to see. Tell me, what is this affliction? What may I do to assist you? Weston eyed him over the rim of his glass. It is a small request. Easily accomplished, especially for one of your good nature. A brief task that will nevertheless mean a great deal to me, for it might save my soul, as well as my life. Stokes did not allow his disappointment to rise to the surface. A brief task would be difficult to avoid, while a simple task would be difficult to intentionally fumble. Instead, he continued his act. Name it! You have but to ask, of course. You are a good man, Weston said. To put it plain, what I need is for you to blow out a candle. Blow out a candle? Stokes repeated, blinking in confusion. I beg your pardon, but did I hear you correctly? Oh, my friend, I'm afraid there is more to the matter. But that is the crux of it. I need you to blow out a candle. Stokes glanced around, searching for some sign that he was the target of an elaborate joke, but the drawing room remained stubbornly vacant. Alexander could not be trusted with this? He asked. A household of servants could not snuff out a candle for you? I am eager to hear what constitutes the more part of this matter, then. Understandable, Weston said. I would ask nothing of you without a proper explanation. It is not a dangerous task, not for you. But as you shall see, I'm afraid it would reflect poorly on me should word get out. Even so, it will surely debase my character in the eyes of the very friend I treasure most. He cast his gaze to the floor, bowing his head. The very friend I do not deserve. Surely you are not speaking of me, Montrose. I find it hard to believe that there is anything you could reveal which would lower my estimation of your character. You have ever been a loyal man and true... Weston cut him off, raising his face to reveal a pained expression. Outwardly, perhaps. But in my head, Sherwood? No, in my head and in my heart. I have been a spiteful and jealous man. Every acquisition I've made, every word I have spoken to you and about you, they have all been accompanied by the urgent desire to be better than you, to prove in some petty manner that I am the more worthwhile man. You may think me ill now, yet that has always been my true sickness, that I conceal the soul of a cur. I have been spiteful and resentful, while you have never shown me anything but friendship and love, and for that I am deeply sorry, Sherwood. And I am sorry to realize what a fool I have been only now, when I must ask for your assistance. I'm ashamed. It has taken the flames of the devil to burn the sin out of me. Stokes was speechless. He stared at the ailing man before him, shivering and sweating beside the fire, and wondered if he was looking at a mirror of himself, a dim funhouse opposite, reduced to the hapless shadow by the light of misfortune. There, but for the grace of God, he thought to himself. For while he had always suspected Weston felt the same as he, the proof of it had never fully presented itself until now. Now, here it was, laid out between them. That which had been unspoken for so long had finally been spoken, and Weston had broken first. Their play had reached its final act, and the truth was revealed. Or was it? It was Weston who had done the revealing. Weston had confessed to Stokes, seemingly with no thought that his bitter resentments were shared. Thus, in Weston's mind, Stokes was still the better man for not having stooped to his level. By admitting nothing in return, Stokes was now the injured party. Stokes was the righteous one. Stokes was victorious. I do not know what to think, he said, once he felt certain he could suppress the smugness in his voice. I had no idea that our friendship caused you such distress. I feel I must apologize for my inattention. Had I but known... Weston silenced him by throwing his glass into the fireplace. It shattered, the remaining liquor producing an angry hiss from the flames. "Charitable to me even now," he rasped. "Charitable and forgiving, no! I do not deserve a friend such as you." "Calm yourself, Montrose. Forgiving I may be, but I would not forgive myself if my words worsened your health. I will say nothing more until I hear now how I may assist with your present condition. Come now, out with it." Weston glowered at the fire for several minutes, his breathing ragged, his shoulders slumped. Finally he spoke, as if to himself. My condition, indeed, for I brought it upon myself. I brought the damned thing into my house." Stokes waited patiently, still savoring his victory, until Weston turned back to him with a question. "Witchwick candles," he said. "Have you heard of them?" Stokes was taken aback by this sudden change in topic. He narrowed his eyes, thinking hard and speaking with deliberate slowness. "Witchwick candles? Let me see. I believe I have heard of them. I've at least heard the name somewhere." He had in fact first heard the name from Alexander. Weston's steward was not exactly a spy, but from time to time Stokes would pass Alexander a coin, now and then a bottle, so as to learn what plans Weston was engaged in. In this manner he had outmaneuvered his rival's magical purchases on more than a few occasions, and not long ago Alexander had let slip that Witchwick candles were Weston's latest obsession. None of this was anything Stokes wished to reveal, of course, so he continued the pretense of trying to remember. "I should have known rumors of their existence would have reached you," Weston said, letting him off the hook. "But do you know their legend?" "No, merely the name. They are supernatural items, correct?" "Of course. And I found one." "Indeed? What is their history, then? What powers do they have?" Weston seemed to sink further into his blankets, as if he found it necessary to warm himself in order to answer these questions. "Witchwick candles, as their name implies, have to do with witches. They are black candles, black as midnight, and singular in composition. Their wax scarcely runs, and for this reason they are never used up." "Where do they come from?" "Wherever people burned witches," Weston said with a shrug. "Real witches, not those created from vengeance and hysteria. As I've heard it, when a witch was tried and sentenced to the flames, and when her sister witches found out, often they could do nothing for her. Often they wished to do nothing for her, as covens were not the cordial sororities some believed them to be. Witches have never been known for extending generosities, and this trait applied even between themselves." "This corresponds to what I have learned of witches," Stokes nodded. "Ah, but when it came to revenge?" "Revenge was another matter entirely, and one which they took a keen delight in freely dispensing. Before the day came when their doomed sister was to be led to the pyre, the other witches would sometimes enlist a child, or else trade sinful favors with her executioners, in order to gain their assistance in capturing her dying essences." "Essences?" "Her burning flesh, her boiling blood, the fat of her that dripped into the flames, these were the results of her gruesome agonies, refined by the fire. In her final moments, the witch not only shrieked curses at her tormentors, but she became one herself, in both body and spirit, and the renderings of this curse were caught in a bowl or a plate that had been hidden amongst the logs at her feet. The bowl was later recovered by her sisters, whereupon the contents were incorporated into the wax of a candle, while a twining of the burned witch's hair became the wick. No doubt there was some dark ceremony involved as well." "Dreadful," said Stokes, shuddering as he visualized the scene of execution which Weston described, his imagination aided by a sudden snap and sizzle from a log collapsing in the fireplace. "But to what end?" "As I said, revenge. A witch may not lift a crooked finger to save her sister, but a slight against one is still a slight against all. Once made, such candles were delivered under cover of night to the home of the dead woman's accusers or to her judge. There they would be lit, and the unsuspecting victims would suffer the coven's retaliation. Often their families suffered as well, for a household waking to the candle's effects would be thrust into utter turmoil and panic with no idea as to the source of their distress. Some of this is speculation, of course, but I have reason to believe it. I am now convinced of the power of these candles. Weston's frail voice trailed off as he hesitated, but Stokes, feeling his occult interest piqued, did not let him rest. The candle's effects. Can you describe them? I can, unfortunately. When lit, the very flame itself turns black. It does not illuminate its environs. Instead, it darkens. It devours any light about it, much the reverse of how light normally disperses darkness. It is a darkness that begins small, but which weaves itself together like a mist, reaching out to invade every corner as the light succumbs to its warp and weft. There is no heat. On the contrary, the cold it emits is painful. Darkness and cold can be borne. Surely there is more. I'm afraid so. Beyond that, and far worse, it's the manner in which the candle pulls at one's soul. Whoever lights the wick is spared, but all others are subjected to quickened aging. They undergo a tearing of the spirit, as if Satan himself is uncoiling their souls from their bodies, raveling them down through that black flame into the pits of hell. This is the chief danger of exposure to a witchwick. You see in me the results. Weston stopped talking, and both men gazed silently into the fire. Stokes pictured its fingers of light inverted to shades of gray and black, and he now found himself glad of the heat, for it provided assurance against the chill he felt descending upon him. At length he asked another question. Am I to take it, then, that once obtained, you lit your witchwick? Weston gave him a grim smile. I am as experienced as yourself in magic, Sherwood, and we both know better than to do a thing so rash without proper precautionary measures. No, I did not light it, but I am still at fault, for I was careless. I did not mention the candle's dangers to Alexander. I see. Alexander lit it. Weston nodded. I am going to tell you something now. Something which I have only shared with Alexander. There is a secret storage room in my exhibition hall, a kind of cellar vault where I hold objects until I feel they can be safely displayed. There are pieces in there that will probably never see daylight, for they still frighten me. A shrewd approach when dealing with the occult, said Stokes. He felt a passing irritation at Alexander for never mentioning this secret room. Upon reflection, however, he realized that if word ever came back to Weston that this particular secret was known, then Alexander's employer would have only known one person to blame for letting it slip. Yes, and I thought it was a sensible method to guard against danger, said Weston. However, I still charged Alexander with the maintenance of this chamber. I showed him its location and how to access it, admonishing him to do so only long before dawn, when none would see. Naturally, I impressed upon him the hazards of disturbing anything within. Naturally, I do much the same with my staff, and I have always considered your Alexander to be an intelligent man. As have I. However, a Witchwick Candle is still a candle, in form at least. I had not got round to securing it beneath glass when it came time for Alexander's scheduled duties. Without suspecting its properties, he lit it. He was unaffected, of course, but when he heard the resulting chaos in the household, the cries and screams, he abandoned the chamber to find out what was happening. The candle remains there now, burning without melting. Could he not have blown it out? Perhaps, but when I awoke, I chased away any servants that remained, fearing for their lives. Alexander would have stayed, but I was so enraged at what he had done that I was beyond thought. I am ashamed to say that I shouted and beat on him until he ran off. He must have been desperate with fear, for I have never treated him so roughly. I have no idea where he has fled. Stokes considered the tale, attempting to find any aspects he had not been told. Long years of hatred had instilled within him an instinctive distrust of the shivering man seated before him, and despite having won their unspoken contest of wills, he still did not like the thought of coming to Weston's aid. The longer he postponed action, the better, for his rival looked on the verge of collapse merely from conversing. "I am grateful you sought me in your hour of need," he said at last, "but while I defy any man to call me coward, I am unsure how to proceed. Won't the candle affect me as well?" Weston laughed until he choked. When he recovered, he shook his head in amazement. "Humble as ever. No, my dear Sherwood, beyond even your vast experience handling magical items, you shall be safe enough, at least for the time required to blow out the black flame." "You seem certain of this." "I was not, until you walked into the room. Then I knew the truth. You see, the candle's effects are more pronounced for those with much more darkness upon their souls, and your very presence has confirmed to me that you are the closest thing to an angel I shall likely ever see. That is why I could not trust the servants. They were shriveling before me, one and all." This was praise that Stokes found troubling, for he was well aware that he was far from angelic, and yet thus far he had felt none of the withering power of the Witchwick Candle. Then another thought occurred to him. "How is it that you remain here, Montrose? Obviously ill, but you still appear to have a soul. To put it indelicately, should you not be dead?" Another grim smile drifted to Weston's lips. "Perhaps, or perhaps, despite my many faults, there is some strength of character within me." "I did not mean—" No, I know you didn't. I am no saint, that is certain, but neither am I pure evil. The truth is, the closer one comes to the candle, the more one's imperfections are magnified. Even you may begin to feel more uncomfortable when coming nearer to it, for the candle will seize upon any hint of darkness like the sea snatching at an anchor. And we all have sinned and fallen short, have we not? My servants were in their quarters, some distance away, yet they were already fast upon the same road I am now traveling, much faster than myself." He chuckled sourly. I shall have to review my hiring practices." "But then why not manage the Black Flame yourself?" "I attempted it, of course. Within 20 paces of its pedestal I very nearly collapsed. Further, and I would not be talking to you. I crawled away and closed the chamber, or I would not even be here to perform the role of sentinel in my own castle. This is my responsibility, and for all my shortcomings I do feel a sense of duty." "Then you are quite right to value your integrity. You are not so low as you have claimed, and I still believe you are not." As Stokes heard himself saying these words, he wondered if they came from his years of playing at the role of true friend, or if they were an attempt to buffer his own soul against the task he saw looming ahead. Defending his old enemy made him feel tarnished, as always, but less so now that his enemy was repentant. Still, this man was asking him to face a danger both mortal and spiritual, one that he was viewing with increasing trepidation, so some bitterness remained. "And yet I am here, feeling no ill effects where others have withered," Stokes mused. For a brief moment he considered confessing his own secrets to Weston in order to purge himself fully, but no. He decided to keep some information to himself. The time for such revelations had not arrived. Now that he knew the candle's power, he was content to bask in Weston's fall from grace. And besides, perhaps he was not really so wicked as he feared himself to be. How much darker than this were most souls, when what he had always considered to be the ungodliest of hate he felt within himself warranted not even headache in the presence of a Witchwick. He looked at his host then, attempting to read what was within his sweating brow. Or is all this merely what he wishes me to think? Weston interrupted his ruminations. "Once again I must apologize, for I fear that there is not much time. Not for me, that is. The candle burns, leeching my soul even through the walls. I admit that this is a grave thing to ask, and I shall accept whatever you decide, but if you do not act soon, I will die. Then this house and all it contains will sit in a kind of purgatory for anyone who approaches it, while bearing the ordinary blemishes of sin will feel the candle's grasping pull, and avoid the place at all costs." I might find that acceptable, thought Stokes. According to the papers that they had signed so long ago, this purgatory would then belong to him. All that was required was for him to leave and simply return later. But he did not move from his chair. This chance to prove himself the better man once and for all, and to have his rival bear witness to it, was a temptation he knew he could not resist. Moreover, he would be able to prove it to himself. Aiding Weston would be his own act of atonement. A secret atonement, to be sure. But was it not the case that showing kindness to one's beaten enemies was a sign of true virtue? In victory, charity felt more affordable. And above even these considerations, he could not deny the lure of an old and familiar challenge. Matching wits with magic was a thrill few understood. Still, he had come prepared to be cautious, and would remain so. If Weston somehow abused his trust, well, he had a simple plan for that. "I will help you, Montrose," he finally declared. "I will attempt to blow out the candle. I question my own pureness in the face of this evil, but I will at least try." "You have lifted my heart, then, in so much is impossible till the deed is done." Weston stood on quaking legs, gathering the blanket which lay across his shoulders closer about himself. "We shall go together, and I will accompany you as far as I can manage." The matter decided, Stokes felt a strange combination of calm and trepidation that always descended upon him preceding any perilous endeavor. His senses seemed to expand as his mind began to prime itself, aware that life and death might soon hinge upon its ability to calculate for unexpected dangers. Weston led him across the drawing room, through thick double doors, to the large adjoining ballroom that served as Weston's gallery and private museum. Here were hundreds of displays lining the walls and gathered in aisles, each affixed with a brass plate denoting the name of the item contained within, as well as its history and a description of the magic it possessed. It was an impressive collection. Swords, armor, and jewelry were exhibited almost by default, but the majority of objects were more pedestrian in appearance. A teacup of infinite tea, horseshoes that turned water to ice beneath unsuspecting hooves, unbreakable nails that wormed their way out of any construction, and so on. Fauna and flora were present as well, including pinned butterflies whose colors shifted with every viewing angle, a misshapen skull said to be from a minotaur, and behind thick glass, exotic flowers which screamed like frightened children when roused. Just as on many previous visits, Stokes could not help the feeling of desire that came over him, the collector's craving to possess all he saw, even the feathered wooden mask that seemed to watch them both with dark loathing as they passed by. He had always believed that it would look perfect mounted beside the mummified homunculus skeleton that he had kept in the east wing of his own house. The screaming flowers were the only things he had no interest in, for they required too much maintenance, or so he told himself. "The cold is biting harder the closer we come," Weston remarked as he shuffled forward. "Can you not feel even a twinge of it?" Stokes was unsure, but decided that this was his opportunity to take advantage of Weston's glacial pace. "I think it best if I fetched my riding coat," he said. "I do not wish to be caught unaware." By the time he returned, Weston had reached the far end of the great hall. Clouds had gathered outside, and through the high windows and arching skylights the weird, otherworldly hues of an approaching storm bleached the colors from the ballroom. Weston was waiting in front of his clock made of ticking bones. "A magnificent find, this clock," said Stokes as he pulled up the collar of his coat. He, too, was shivering now. "You think so?" "I did as well at first. But now I wonder what benefit it would be to hear its chime. 1 minute's warning does not afford its owner much opportunity to sidestep death." "Time enough for prayers, I suppose. Help me move it further out of our way, if you please." The clock rolled smoothly on its wheeled pallet. Affixed to the wall behind it was a curtain of purple velvet, which hung in disarray from scattered hooks, some dangling as if they had recently been pulled with hasty force. With evident effort, Weston drew the heavy curtain fully aside, revealing a black marble wall. Being well acquainted with secret passageways, Stokes peered closely at the smooth white surface before him. "I see a thin seam, but no hinge." "Nor should you. I'll impose on you once more to bring me the Arabian dagger from the neighboring display." Stokes handed it to him, and once Weston held the artifact, he began searching the wall, running his hand across the twisting marble veins. Finding the one he desired, he replaced his finger with the dagger's tip. Then in one motion he pushed the blade straight through the marble. It went in smoothly, like a key sliding in an invisible lock. and remained fixed, as if the marble was the same consistency of a block of cheese. Stokes heard a click. Then, with the grating sound of stone scraping on stone, a rectangular section of the wall next to the blade trundled back before drawing aside. "Ingenious," Stokes remarked. "The knife that does no surface damage, only it can reach through the solid face and trigger the opening mechanism." Weston managed to nod, but he was clutching at his chest now. "I would be proud to hear you say it," he gasped, "but opening this portal has given easier access to the coldness within. The Witchwick tears at me." He waved his hands in front of his face, fingers flicking and grasping at the air. "Do you see the strands of soul stuffs unwinding from my body?" "No, I do not." Weston kept watching the play of his fingers, his eyes wide with astonishment. "It flows like smoke, like blood in a wash basin, from wounds I cannot staunch. I feel the echoes of pain doubling and redoubling on top of the pain itself. We must hurry, then. Let us put this to rest so that you may recover." "Yes. Yes, indeed. Time is slipping." Stokes had to gently shake Weston by the shoulder until he tore his eyes away from his hand. "Yes, of course," Weston murmured, tugging his blanket tight around his neck like a man about to step into a blizzard. "We must hurry." "How shall we proceed?" "Inside the opening there is an alcove, where you will find a matchstick and a candle, a normal candle, I should say. Light it, and I will go with you to the threshold of darkness, before the darkness comes to us." This last statement took Stokes by surprise. He had been wary that Weston would expect him to enter alone. "Are you quite sure that you have the strength?" he asked. "I will not abandon you in the presence of evil," Weston declared, squaring his quivering shoulders. His pale, sweaty features resolved into solid determination. "It falls to you to finish the task, but I will be your shadow until my strength fails." "As you wish, Montrose. I will be glad of your company, for I begin to think it unwise to be fearless." "It is always wise to fear the trickeries of magic. This we both know." As Weston had directed him, Stokes found the normal candle inside the alcove, and by the light of this slim taper, he led the way down a flight of uneven stone stairs. Past the entrance, the smooth white marble of the ballroom was replaced by roughly hewn rock. "How far does this continue?" he asked, pausing at the bottom step. "Not far, but some distance before it widens to a chamber. The Witchwick is near the center of the chamber, upon a pedestal half the height of a man." "Very well," said Stokes, and with Weston pinching his coat sleeve to remain steady, the two of them pushed forward into the gloom. Stokes walked slowly. The rough rock walls, braced at intervals by thick wooden beams, narrowed and began to squirm with scurrying shadows as the passage sloped downwards. Darkness pressed close, and the moist smell of dirt reminded Stokes of standing near an open grave. As he progressed, he felt the cold air rising, making his skin prickle. Feet passed, then yards. He held his taper before him, squinting beyond its tiny glow to try to discern all he could of his surroundings. For the most part, though, he watched the floor, his distrust of Weston making him leery of falling into a pit. He prepared himself to turn and grab the man by the throat should the need arise. At length, the candle he held suddenly guttered, nearly extinguishing. Its flame seemed to be drawn forward, whether blown by a slight breeze from the ballroom or pulled by the darkening powers of the Witchwick he could not tell. He quickly cupped his hand around the light, and through his fingers, in its dancing glimmer, he saw that they had reached the chamber Weston had spoken of. The walls curved away to either side, disappearing from sight. A round chamber, then not large, but wide enough for its opposite side to be invisible. A few more paces, and they began to pass among the enclosure stands reserved for Weston's most dangerous magical items. Stokes wandered closer, unable to restrain himself from trying to look inside at least a few of these stands, hoping to catch a glimpse of the treasures Weston kept hidden away from exhibition. He was frowning at the thin layer of dust upon the glass top of the nearest enclosure when he caught sight of the pedestal in the center of the room. A squat, dark shape sat atop the pedestal, and a ghostly glint found his eyes. As if it knew he was nearing his destination, the candle Stokes held began fluttering furiously. He cupped his hand even tighter about the flame, almost singeing himself as he stepped forward. Like the tiny light he held, he felt drawn to the darkness ahead. "Is this it?" he whispered from the side of his mouth. Weston tugged weakly at his elbow once, signaling yes. Heart beating, perspiring yet chilled, Stokes continued to move forward, each step coming slower than the previous one. He was nearly to the pedestal now, and he bent closer, absorbed by the familiar feeling of vibrating anticipation which he felt every time he faced a magical revelation. His eyes, his mind, his very soul was absorbed into a pinprick of time, focused to the point where the whole world had collapsed into a single hesitating moment. The moment stretched, and in sympathy with the cessation of time, his own candle's flames stopped fluttering and evened. Realizing it might be his one chance to see the Witchwick's resting place before all illumination was doused, Stokes snatched his hand away. Before him on the pedestal was no black candle made from witches. Where it should have been, in a grotesque mockery of his quivering anticipation, there sat a man's head. Dried blood caked the ragged edge of his severed neck, and a swollen tongue bulged repulsively from its slack mouth. The face wore a startled expression, and the whites of its horrified eyes seemed to show that it was just as surprised to find itself here as Stokes was. It was Alexander. Stokes turned and seized Weston then, before the man could escape, but his hand pushed straight into the dark form that had accompanied him into the chamber. For an instant his grasp closed upon something that was very nearly nothing, and then the shadowy figure slipped between his fingers and capered into the surrounding darkness before melting away. "Weston!" Stokes bellowed. In the distance, back up the passageway, he saw the silhouette of his enemy watching him, framed by the dim light of the ballroom. He could hear the man's laughter. While his mind raced to understand how he had been misled, he took a deep breath of tomb-scented air and began to move with deliberate calmness back toward the entrance, knowing all the while that it was futile. The trap had been sprung the moment he had descended into the vault. "Your blanket!" Stokes called, his voice rebounding off the walls. "Your blanket was made of the cloak of living shadows, the one that you showed off to so much amusement at your last gathering." "Correct, old friend," came Weston's answer. "It would appear that the power to cast a living shadow has a use beyond lifting young ladies' skirts from afar." Weston's voice was much stronger now, and Stokes could see that he stood upright, as tall and healthy as ever. "And your illness?" "I was waiting for you next to a fireplace, and you certainly took your time arriving. I could not help but sweat. The shivering was merely acting, along with some convincing face paint and grease." "I see," Stokes replied, still moving forward. "And what about the—" He broke off his words, hoping to catch Weston by surprise with a mad dash to the entrance. Weston took a leisurely step back and raised his hand to the Arabian knife still embedded in the wall. With a crack, the thick marble door began to swing shut. It had not settled fully into position as Stokes reached for its edge, but his scraping fingernails could do nothing to reverse its inexorable process. And once stone stopped scraping on stone, the seal was complete. Nothing but darkness remained, for he had tossed his candle aside when he sprang forward. Then through the door he heard Weston's laughter resume. Stokes steadied his breathing and composed himself. He had been prepared for some trickery, and could not yet believe all was lost. Weston would surely feel the urge to gloat, so he waited for the laughter to die down. When it finally subsided, Weston's voice came to him, muffled but gleeful.
"No screaming, Sherwood? No begging? The servants are not due to return for a number of weeks from the holidays that I generously provided them, so please indulge yourself." "All but Alexander?" "Yes, all but Alexander, a traitor in the end." "Why not simply kill me as well, Montrose? Neat and quick. Your dagger could have left you in the clear." "What pleasure in that? In this manner I get to listen to you beg to me to let you out." "Very well, then,"
Stokes replied, his voice as flat as the slab in front of him.
"Let me out. Please." I suppose that's a start, but I'm afraid that there is no turning back now. When begging fails, I shall cherish the knowledge that your bones grace my gallery. But why, Montrose? We've always stalemated each other. What purpose does this serve? Are you really so envious of my own collection?
Stokes could hear Weston pacing back and forth outside, as if he were the caged beast instead of Stokes.
Envious? Hardly. No, Sherwood, when I confessed my sin to you earlier, I was being quite honest. I have hated you for so long. When I discovered Alexander's treachery and I learned that our feelings were mutual, I decided it was time to win our hidden war. This ruse struck my fancy, since it would be your own pride that did you in. Good Lord, I could almost hear the wheels turning in your head, wondering if you really were a better man than everyone else. Better than me. I see. And since you talk of pride, I expect you made sure not to fall victim to it yourself? You've thought of everything? Everything. With your disappearance and with the lack of any evidence of foul play, everyone will assume you dabbled in magic too dark to overcome. There may be a few who look upon me with suspicion for a time, but that will pass. And yes, once I have mourned you appropriately, I shall also enjoy adding your collection to mine. I must thank you for that.
Stokes grunted.
You're welcome. And what of the Witchwick Candle? A legend only,
Weston said.
I put the name to Alexander in hopes of sustaining your belief in my tale. Then it worked very well, your plan. Having been fooled, I must acknowledge your superiority. So easily! I would have thought you might rage at me for a bit. There is no call for childish antics, Montrose. Not between gentlemen. You take a fatalistic approach.
Weston sighed insincerely.
I'm disappointed. Still, there is plenty of time for your bravery to wane. For you must believe me when I say there is no escape from that chamber. Every magical item has been removed. You have nothing but poor Alexander to keep you company. Oh, I do believe you, Montrose. Obviously, I have no recourse but to sit on these steps and consider the sins that have brought me to this end. Stoicism becomes you. Very well then, I shall offer a toast to your spirit as I finish off the brandy and celebrate my victory. I will return later to hear your pleas, once your situation becomes clear and the desperation sets in. I wonder what offers you will make me then. We shall see,
Stokes murmured. Hearing Weston's footsteps move off, Stokes did as he described. He sat upon the cold stone stairs. He did not, however, consider his sins. Instead, he relaxed as best as he could, given the circumstances. He drummed his fingers, keeping time with the ticking of the bone clock just outside his prison, and he thought. He was certain that Weston would have made his trap impregnable. Blindly feeling around for latches and levers in hopes of finding a secret release would be a waste of time. Calling for help would be fruitless as well, and attempting to dig his way out through the layers of earth, rock, and marble which enclosed him would take far too long, even if he had possessed a suitable digging tool. No, he had nothing but his own mind to work with, and it would have to be enough. When Weston returned, everything would depend upon his own powers of bargaining. So as he sat there on the stairs, Stokes considered what he had to offer. In the darkness, he smiled. As he had been expecting, he did not have long to wait. A hacking cough informed him that his captor had returned. It came from the vicinity of the floor, and was accompanied by a shuffling noise, as if Weston was dragging himself back to the vault. Stokes pressed his ear to the marble and listened. Weakly then, sounding much the same as when Stokes had first entered his house, Weston spoke.
What? What have you done? More gloating, Montrose? So soon? Why, I've hardly had time to recall all my boyhood sins, let alone those of manhood.
He heard Weston spit.
You bastard! You'll have to speak louder, my friend. This marble is ill-suited to the task of conducting voices. Can you believe it sounded as if you called me a bastard? Where? Where did you find it? Oh, I see. You're referring to the Witchwick Candle. Suffice it to say that I found one, and the where of it I shall leave to your imagination. But how? They are myths! Not so, as you have discovered. Where, damn you? Sadly, I cannot divulge my sources to a competitor, even one so honorable as yourself, but I am in your debt. Although Alexander, may he rest in peace, delivered to me the name of the candles, and though I found one, I honestly had no idea of the legend behind it. When I brought the thing with me today, I only intended to kindle a spark of jealousy in your breast. You were most kind to provide me with the knowledge of the candle's uses.
Stokes spoke truthfully. He had been glad to learn of the Witchwick's powers, and relieved that he had not dared to light it inside his own house. For weeks after obtaining it, the dark object had menaced his dreams, and he had begun to wonder if Weston had been seeking it just to cause him unrest. He now chided himself for being taken in by Weston's tale, but he could forgive himself this lapse, for he had held the Witchwick Candle in his own hands and sensed its evil. Weston had embroidered his fabrications with enough research to convince Stokes that he too possessed a witch's candle, and Stokes had been blinded by the twin desires to witness the candle's effects and to see Weston humbled. He had not been fooled completely, however. He took pride in his instincts, for they had saved him. Wary of a trap, when he returned to the drawing room for his riding coat, he had taken the opportunity to light the witchwick it concealed, and left the black candle burning on the mantelpiece. It had been a precaution, but a precaution that had proved wise, for he knew Weston would need him to blow out the candle as well, and it was always good to be needed. With his ear still to the door, Stokes spoke again.
Tell me what you see, Montrose. Is it as terrible as you described? What are you feeling?
His curiosity was genuine, for when he had lit the witchwick, he had stared for only a moment at its strange black flame before hurrying from the drawing room. The darkness had just begun to expand as he closed the doors, and he had only caught a glimpse of the fireplace as the yellow tongues within had started to turn gray.
You bastard!
Weston repeated.
Tell me, Montrose, at the present moment I am blind in here, and I wish to hear of the witchwick. Is it just as you portrayed? It is worse,
Weston said, and Stokes could hear his gritted teeth.
It is worse. You do not know what you've done. Then tell me, or release me, and I shall see for myself. The witchwick burns with cold and shadow. But it is happening too fast already. It has enveloped the drawing room and the main hall. When I opened my drawing room doors, it staggered me. My very soul, the darkness is coming this way, coming for us both.
Stokes shook his head.
Not for me, dear friend. I lit the witchwick, therefore I remain unaffected. I have the power to snuff out the flame. You wanted to know what I would offer for my release? Let me save you.
Weston did not seem to hear him.
Coming this way, black snakes of the devil's entrails. Don't you understand, Sherwood? The legend did not take into account my collection. The candle is feeding on the magic contained in this room. It's happening even faster than in the legend. So much faster.
Stokes frowned. He could hear nothing troubling beyond his prison. Not the crackling of black fire, nor the dark, ominous rumbling of something evil approaching. All seemed calm and still outside. Then in the distance, he heard the snapping of thin glass. He winced as the screaming flowers began to shriek in unison, assaulting him with their wailing imitation of dozens of terror-filled children. It was a noise to drive spikes into a man's heart, but almost as quickly the screams began to fade. The silence that followed was chilling, for Stokes could now imagine the flowers curling into a sudden frost as the witchwick's darkness took them.
Montrose,
he said, his voice rising.
Let me out. I will snuff out the candle. You called me here under that pretense, and now it is reality. No more games.
Weston's reply came haltingly, laced through with coughing and wheezing.
It has reached the ceiling. Billowing like I remember the feasting eels I saw in the tropics devouring a wounded boar. The beast was pulled under, thrashing and squealing beneath their slithering mass. I feel like that pig, Sherwood. I lied to you before, but now I can indeed see my soul pouring out from me through my skin, from my eyes. Tendrils carried on blackest smoke, drawn into the advancing void. Open the door, Montrose! It nears, Sherwood, silent, but spreading like upturned pitch. For the love of God, man, I can save you! I can save us both! No. No. No, you cannot. What? Why? Why, damn you, why are you so blinded by your hatred for me? There is still time.
But Weston was gasping over and over. It took several seconds for Stokes to realize that the gasps were laughter. Weston was laughing again, and Stokes was incensed.
Have you gone insane, Montrose? Let me out! I would,
Weston said, his voice hoarse.
I would have already. I believe you would have saved me when it came down to it. But I had to make sure. I could not afford to have second thoughts to show mercy, not to my enemy.
Stokes was shouting at the entrance now, wishing that he could reach through and slap Weston.
What are you saying? Just open the door! Let me out! I cannot!
Weston groaned.
I snapped the Arabian blade, broke it off at the hilt in the marble. The only way to trigger the door. No, that can't be! It is! I doomed you, Sherwood. I doomed you, and you doomed us both.
As if to punctuate Weston's words, a new sound broke upon them at the moment. An interruption that made Stokes close his gaping mouth in confusion. A strange clicking rattle, high-pitched and hollow. He could not place it at first, until it came to him that it was the chime of the bone clock, signifying that its owner had but 1 minute remaining until his death. Stokes screamed like a madman, pounding and shouting for Weston to do something, anything. There had to be another way, some other magic that would free him. But the minutes sped quickly past as he bloodied his fist against the unyielding slab of the door. Eventually he stopped himself, catching his breath and hoping against hope. He pressed his ear to the slab once more, quietly whispering,
Montrose! Montrose, are you there?
No reply came. Instead, with a hissing crackle, the marble suddenly turned far colder than ice. He wrenched himself away at the shock of pain it caused, holding his hand to his cheek. Then all was dark, and all was silent, save for the quiet ticking of Weston's bone clock. But it was no longer Weston's clock, he realized. It now belonged to Stokes, part of his inheritance. He wondered how many days he would last, trapped within his own tomb, until he heard its chime.